Ann Ravitch, a historian of education at New York University, discusses her opinions on how pressure groups
Well, good evening. I think we're about ready to begin. Thank you all for joining us at the Chicago Public Library for this wonderful event with Adam Nicolson. We are so pleased to have him here to celebrate the publication of his new book, God's Secretaries, The Making of the King James Bible. I'd like to also thank C-SPAN, who's here tonight filming the event for Book TV. It will air at some point in the near future. And I'd like to thank Brent Books and Cards, who's also here to sell the book tonight. They will be here after the presentation, and you can purchase your books at that point. Mr. Nicolson will be talking and taking your questions throughout the evening, and then signing books afterwards, and we'll do that right up here. So, this book is fascinating. As you know, the King James Bible is arguably the most awe-inspiring work of English prose ever produced. It, of course, has provided the quintessential understanding of Christianity, but many don't realize that it has also had a great historical impact in its ability to unify England and provide a template for the English language. So, who produced this work of genius? Adam Nicolson's book, God's Secretaries, The Making of the King James Bible, beautifully chronicles the work of some 50 scholars and clergymen whose conflicting theologies and doctrines had to come together to produce the King James Bible. God's Secretaries is truly a fascinating book, and Mr. Nicolson's writing deftly approaches this subject in a way that will engage you, I'm sure, till the end. Adam Nicolson has been both a publisher and a travel writer and is the author of many award-winning books, including the recent Sea Room. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Adam Nicolson.
Well, it's a very great pleasure to be here. The last talk I did in England before coming here at the beginning of the week was in the British Library, and Leah tells me that this is the only library in the world that is greater than the British Library, so I feel I've arrived in some version of heaven here anyway. The King James Bible, the reason, as Leah said, I haven't really written about subjects like this before. And the reason that I embarked on this rather terrifying project, filled as it is with enormous armies of extraordinarily expert and slightly vitriolic scholars, is that I was, whenever it was, 3 years ago, I was writing a book for the British government, a piece of propaganda it was, about something called the Millennium Dome. Now, I don't know if the fame or infamy of the Millennium Dome reached Chicago, but it was meant to be a great celebration and unification of all the diverse currents in British life at the turn of the millennium. It was meant to somehow sum up everything that was best about England. And inevitably, it ended up summing up everything that was worst about England. Argument, muddle, confusion, dreadful compromise, ugliness, tawdriness. And my job was to say this was the most marvellous thing that had ever happened. It was, as you can imagine, a nightmare. And a friend of mine said, well, you know what you should be writing about? You should be writing about the King James Bible. Because that, too, was a great national project, a government project, intended to unify all the various threads and currents in English national life, to create a great celebratory, single, unifying organism. And it succeeded. And it succeeded to the extent that it has lasted 4 centuries. This is the 400th anniversary of the accession of James I, whose idea it was. And so I embarked on this shark-infested sea of 17th century history and biblical scholarship. And the book I've written, in effect, I think is really a political history of the genesis of the King James Bible. The 16th century in England had been a terrible muddle in that the Reformation had never really happened properly in England. Henry VIII had embraced it largely to get a new wife and to get rid of the Pope. Then had rejected all Reformation ideas at the end of his life. Then his son, Edward VI, had reverted to a very extreme form of Reformation ideas and persecuted all kinds of Catholics. Then his sister, Mary, Bloody Mary, turned it the other way. And Elizabeth, arriving on the throne after this kind of yo-yo history, effectively paralysed it, so that the tensions and the arguments were left unresolved for the rest of the 16th century. It's always called the Elizabethan settlement, as if some kind of great resolution had been made. But it wasn't at all. It was everybody was simply left in situ, and no real reformation had occurred. The Church of England was still intensely Catholic in many ways, and yet also extremely Protestant. Its theology was totally Calvinist, its liturgy almost entirely Catholic. And so one of the effects of this sort of irresolution and lack of certainty in that religious history is that by the end of the 16th century, England was left with two Bibles, two competing versions of the Bible. One was a Calvinist translation made in Geneva by English exiles in the 1550s called the Geneva Bible, which is a very good book. It's extremely well done. It is absolutely filled with hints and tips on how to approach God. It's a kind of, DIY God manual, in effect. And it is deeply anti-monarchical. The word king appears 400 times in the Old Testament, and every time in the Geneva Bible it is translated as tyrant. And needless to say, this doesn't go down very well with the royal powers that be. So they had their own Bible. They got a string of bishops to make a translation in the 1570s called the Bishop's Bible. A ludicrous production in many ways. It has on its title page portraits, not as you might expect of apostles and God even, but of the ministers in Elizabeth's government. Portraits of Leicester and Burghley and Walsingham, the spy master, presiding over this thing. And needless to say, it was deeply unpopular. It was also incredibly incompetent. The phrase which appears in the King James Bible as "cast thy bread upon the waters," which we all know, is translated in the Bishop's Bible as "lay thy bread upon wet faces," which doesn't quite have the same ring. So you have this unsorted out situation. Elizabeth dies at last in 1603, not regretted or mourned. She was too old, too crusty, too indecisive, too difficult to talk to. And James, her cousin, arrives from Scotland. A fascinating and I think in many ways sympathetic figure, much more sympathetic than history on the whole has allowed him to be. He'd had a terrible youth and upbringing. His mother had been banished, Mary Queen of Scots had been banished from Scotland when he was 1 year old. And he'd come to the throne, which was the weakest throne in Europe. No money, no army, no means of controlling the violent rivalries of the various barons and peers in Scotland, and subject to the really horrible bullying of the Presbyterian ministers of the Scottish Church, who just sort of kicked him from one end of Edinburgh to the other, telling him endlessly that he was only a subject in his own kingdom where the only true king was Christ the Lord. And sure enough, he ended up hating them. But that sort of dreadful upbringing, which you might imagine, he was kidnapped and held to ransom by one set of lords after another. And that upbringing, you might imagine, would sort of turn him into an sort of angry, the modern orthodoxy would be a sort of angry, unsocialized hooligan in some institution somewhere. But in fact, James went very much the other way. He longed for a kind of peace, for a kind of social coherence and wholeness. He called himself, as his own motto, the Rex Pacificus, the peacemaking king. And on arriving in England, of course, a very intellectual figure, as one almost naturally might expect, that he retreated into books and hunting are his two things. He was so keen on hunting, he once killed all the deer in all the royal parks in Scotland, and more deer had to be imported from England to kind of make up the supply. But he saw in England a possibility, as he thought, of somehow resolving those differences which the 16th century had left unresolved, of making, above all, a Bible which everybody could subscribe to, bishop and Puritan, which would somehow embrace all the different currents, dome-like, that were running in England at the time. So it was within 10 days of inheriting the English throne, this idea was on the stocks. And the way they went about it was extremely governmental. He hired, you could almost say, but he took on, as his companion and guide in this project, Richard Bancroft, who became Archbishop of Canterbury just after James had inherited the throne. And Bancroft set up this extraordinary system. I mean, people often think about the King James Bible as if it's a work of great inspiration, almost written in the way that Old Testament prophets might have written it, sort of late at night somehow, drawn from God. But it was not like that at all. Bancroft drew up this scheme where there were to be 6 committees, each of 8 men, each with a kind of director. Each committee, 2 in Oxford, 2 in Cambridge, and 2 in Westminster, were to be given a different part of the Bible to translate. All these rules are very kind of strictly laid out. Each member of the committee was to translate the whole section of the Bible that his committee was dealing with. Then all 8 would bring their versions to a series of meetings. And then that subcommittee would decide on what they thought was the right version. Then that version would be submitted to an overseeing revising committee in London, which would then end up with a final text, which then inevitably with these things then goes to the Archbishop for a final planing, it's called, and then the king, and then the printer. And so there is no way in which this is an act of inspiration. It is an act of government. And one of the ways in which that governmental nature of the project appears is that the people who were hired for these committees were from as wide a swathe of opinion in England as was possible. And as a result, some of them are a pretty rum lot. There is, for example, a person called Richard Thompson, who is famous as being, he was one of the translators of the epistles, who was famous as being drunk all day while translating the epistles, and then turning at night to the epigrams of Martial, who I'm sure you know is one of the most pornographic of all Latin poets, at the court of Nero. There was William Bedwell, eccentric to the point of lunacy, who seemed to spend most of his life trying to sell an early version of the slide rule to timber merchants with complete failure. There was a very charming and fascinating man, John Layfield, who had gone, he's the great connection with America, in fact. He'd gone with a Protestant buccaneer, the Earl of Cumberland, to Puerto Rico in the 1590s, and wrote a beautiful, beautiful description of the early Caribbean, the untouched Caribbean, in a sense. The great sort of richness of the forests, that first growth forest, which is obviously long gone now. And Layfield, interestingly enough, was on the committee which was dealing with the first books of the Bible, including the descriptions of paradise. And you could make out, I won't go into it now, but you can make out, as I say in the book, very clear parallels between what he sees in the Caribbean and how he translates the words describing Eden. And it is an interesting idea that very deep in English consciousness is a vision of paradise which is actually American. I like that. I hope you like that. In his way, he was Dean of St. Paul's and later became Bishop of Norwich, a great scholar, and who told his friends that he'd preached so often in Latin that he actually found it easier to speak in Latin than in English. But he had the misfortune of falling in love with Anne Orwell, who was acknowledged to be easily the sexiest girl in London at the time. And there was a broadsheet printed about Anne Orwell, which said, "Face she had of filbert hue and bosomed like a swan, back she had of bended yew and wasted by a span, hair she had as black as crow, from her head unto her toe, down, down all over her, hey, nonny, nonny, no." Now, I'm sure there are enough scholars of the Renaissance here to know that hey, nonny, nonny, no is Jacobean code for what in England we call a bit of the other. I don't know what the American version of that is. Anyway, inevitably, John Overall couldn't satisfy Anne Orwell, and she eloped with the far more glamorous figure of a Yorkshire squire called Sir John Selby. And rather bravely and heroically, I think, Overall sent a posse after her to go and get her. And another broadsheet was printed in London, which said, "The Dean of St. Paul's did search for his wife, and where do you think he found her? Even upon Sir John Selby's bed, as flat as any flounder." There is a point to these stories. Which may be slightly obscure, which is this, that in many, many ways, these translators that were hired for this task were not sequestered academics or pure-minded clerics tucked away in their monastic state in the universities. Many of them, not only those sorts, but many of the powerful politicians who were manoeuvring at the top of the church, the bishops, many of whom were members of the King's Privy Council, many involved, in fact, with the agonised financial situation in James's court. These people were men of the world in every sense. And I think that something which this translation has, which maybe later translations, particularly 20th century translations, did not have, is a kind of familiarity with the real world. And there is something to be said that the King James Bible is as good as it is because its translators weren't. You need something wicked to do poetry. There were great, great men involved, and the greatest of them all, I think by any count, is Lancelot Andrewes, who was bishop in succession of Chichester, Ely and Winchester. That's a climb up the ranks of the English church. Very nearly became Archbishop of Canterbury, would have been a cardinal or even a pope, I think, if he'd been a Catholic. A brilliant man who could speak 15 modern languages and 6 ancient. A ruthless persecutor to the death of separatists and Catholics, those who would not conform to the Jacobean kind of central vision of the Church of England, who spent 5 hours, it was said, every morning in prayer, most of it in tears for the miserableness of his own soul. A hypocrite, preaching about the wickedness of nepotism and consistently appointing his brothers to ever more valuable jobs in the English church, making a vast amount of money out of it himself. He gave a party for the king, I think in 1619, which cost £3,000 at a time when a vicar could live on £20 a year. A huge, huge sort of magnate of the church, who was also the greatest writer of English prose, maybe alongside Donne, of the 17th century, in my view, and in T.S. Eliot's view. That's good supporting cast for that view. Famously, Eliot wrote his poem, The Journey of the Magi, using part of a sermon given by Lancelot Andrewes at the Chapel Royal in Christmas 1622. And I'll just read the beginning of it. This is not Eliot's poem, this is Andrewes' sermon. It was no summer progress, and that is a little bit of flattery in itself. You know, progress is the summer progress travel round the country which a king would make. It was no summer progress, a cold coming they had of it at this time of the year, just the worst time of the year to take a journey, and especially a long journey in. The ways deep, the weather sharp, the days short, the sun farthest off in solstitio brumale at the winter solstice, the very dead of winter. And I think that even so briefly as that, you can see that there is a kind of linguistic context which Andrewes embodies more than any other, but certainly not uniquely, as I'll go on in a minute. But there is there a combination of qualities which the King James Bible draws on for its rhetoric, which is a sense of immediacy, of the kind of aliveness of those moments, and a complete closure of the gap of 16th centuries between the journey of the Magi and his description of it. A great dignity and a sort of largeness to what he's saying. A sense of deep musical rhythm, an intuitive understanding that rhythm, that the beauty of rhythm is what makes memorable prose. And a kind of precision, a sense that this is not language that you are casual with, but you're very, very exact with. And I think that those combinations, that combination of qualities is near the heart of the appeal of the translation that they made. There is, it's obvious in a way that a figure like Andrewes, who is the only one that anyone has ever heard of really, should have that sense of beauty as a prime motivator of the way in which he spoke and thought. You know, beauty for Andrewes is not a kind of additional add-on. It is somehow the essence of his subject. But it's that understanding spreads right through the team of translators. And there's a figure it's a funny thing about when you do a book like this, you come to feel great affection for the people that you're describing. They sort of become your team, and I now sort of feel like their manager, you know, and I have to sort of, he's good, but this guy's good too. And so there's one of them, Miles Smith, who was Bishop of Gloucester, strict Calvinist, an austere man in many ways, but a totally neglected prose writer of genius, I think. He wrote the great preface to the Bible, in which he said that the word of God is not a herb, but a tree, or rather a whole paradise of trees of life, which bring forth fruit every month, and the fruit thereof is for meat, and the leaves for medicine. It's not a pot of manna, or a cruse of oil, which were for memory only, or for a meal's meat or two, but as it were a shower of heavenly bread, sufficient for a whole host, be it never so great, and as it were a whole cellar full of oil vessels, whereby all our necessities may be provided for, and our debts discharged. In a word, it is a fountain of most pure water, springing up into everlasting life. I think it's very easy to see in the religion of the Reformation a sequence of kind of violent thoughts, violently expressed. It's often very, very angry. But there is in many of these people a great kind of sweetness and freshness and a kind of innocence, oddly enough, even with all this politicking that the process is surrounded by. And I think that that kind of newness, this idea that they are not dealing with something that is dead and old, but something that is renewable and renewed now. Even while, I mean, exactly the opposite is true. Of course, anything you say about this, the opposite is true. They were deeply in love with the sense of the archaic, and in some ways made their translation more archaic than it needed to have been. But Miles said about translation itself in the preface to the Bible, "Translation it is that openeth the window to let in the light, that breaketh the shell that we may eat the kernel, that putteth aside the curtain that we may look into the most holy place, that removeth the cover of the well, that we may come by the water." And of course, that's saying the same thing 10 times in a row. And that's very Jacobean too, that you never use one word where 100 would do. And there is this is another quality that is the shaping force in the translation, that it's a moment of extraordinary linguistic creativeness, of a kind of bubbling sense of vitality, and they are never at a loose, they never lack for a word. There are always too many words. It's not as if there is a linguistic poverty, as I think you find in the 20th century translations, but this extraordinary abundance of words and images from which they can always pick the best. And that is combined with something else, which is the reason that I called the book God's Secretaries. That it's a phrase of Calvin's, in fact, Amanuensis Dei. And Calvin in the Institutes is talking about the relationship of translators to the scriptures. And he says, translators must never in any way resemble authors. They are not there to make anything. They're not there, the great sort of derogatory word for a writer in Jacobean England is a novelist. They must not be novelists. They must only be God's secretaries. They must submit themselves to the word of God because every iota counts. And you can't play fast and loose with this. I was talking to someone here the other day in Washington about this. And he said the way I was describing it sounded like the Manhattan Project. That this was a kind of government project tinkering with some incredibly delicate and immensely powerful instrument. And I think there is something in that they are dealing with the heart of the matter here, that the Bible is the governing text of every aspect of life, politics included. And so you have this combination of things, of a great linguistic bubble bursting up under them, with an iron frame set over it of fidelity to the text, to the original text. And that is a very, very rich combination that, if you have the iron discipline without the vitality, a dead disaster. If you have the vitality without the iron discipline, an anarchic chaos. And I think that is one explanation for the power of this book, the lasting power of it, that combination of things. Now, I think that one of the easiest ways of looking at the quality of what they did is to compare it with what people did later in the way of Bible translation. That it's easiest to see the virtues of the 1611 translation by looking at the later failures. And if you take, for example, Psalm 8, a very famous psalm. This is the 1611 version. When I consider thy heavens, the work of thy fingers, the moon and the stars which thou hast ordained, what is man that thou art mindful of him, and the son of man that thou visitest him? for thou hast made him a little lower than the angels, and hast crowned him with glory and honour. And I think that the marvels of that passage really consist in one thing, which is an absolute simplicity of vocabulary, set in a rhythm of the utmost stateliness and majesty. And it's necessarily slow. You cannot say that quickly. And it's interesting that this is done, this is written, these English words are written at precisely the moment that Shakespeare is writing his great tragedies. And if you can think of one identifying quality of Shakespearean speech, it's of a kind of cataract of multiplicitous words, just a sort of pouring out, in some ways even tripping over each other, with a kind of overbrimming richness. And I think you can see that this, in that psalm, and again in the King James Bible, that is precisely the opposite quality of what the translators were after. They're about a kind of simplified majesty, a majesty that is mindful of man in a way, that is not a great display of rhetorical brilliance, but of a kind of essential but enormous truth. And I think that it's very interesting that Milton translated this psalm in the 1640s. And he wrote this: "When I behold thy heavens, thy fingers' art, the moon and stars which thou so bright hast set in the pure firmament, then saith my heart, O what is man that thou rememberest yet, and think'st upon him? Or of man begot, that him thou visitest, and of him art found. Scarce to be less than gods thou madest his lot, with honour and with state thou hast him crowned." It is the same meaning in pretty well, and he's having to deal with rhyme and so the iambic pentameter. But to my mind, something has been lost in that from the 1611 version. That Milton is trying to be much grander, is trying to say something much larger. And in doing that, he loses not only the simplicity, but he actually loses the grandeur, that he stretches out too far. And that precious Jacobean amalgam of a kind of clarified richness is lost. It gets worse, though, that in the middle of the 18th century, in 1768, there was a man called Dr. Edward Harwood, who was a Presbyterian minister in Bristol. And he published a version of the New Testament which aimed, he said, to clothe the idea of the apostles with propriety and perspicuity, and replace the bald and barbarous language of the old vulgar version, that's the King James Bible, with the elegance of modern English. And he goes haywire, I think. If you take, for example, the Nunc Dimittis, which we all know from the King James Bible, says, "Lord, now lettest thou thy servant depart in peace according to thy word. For mine eyes have seen thy salvation, which thou hast prepared before the face of all people, a light to lighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel." Harwood's version of that goes, "O God, thy promise to me is amply fulfilled. I now quit the post of human life with satisfaction and joy, since thou hast indulged mine eyes with so divine a spectacle as the great Messiah," which doesn't quite, I don't think, have the same impact. But needless to say, Harwood gets it most wrong where he needs to get it most right. At the Transfiguration, when the divinity of Jesus is revealed to the apostles, with it, his clothes and his face glow and shine in front of them, Peter stands there amazed and is scarcely able to speak at this extraordinary sight. And William Tyndale, who I haven't mentioned until now, but the great Protestant martyr and translator of the Bible in the 1530s, the first English Reformation translation, Tyndale had translated Peter's words as, "Master, here is good being for us," which is odd. I think, and bony, but very Tyndale-like. It's just very kind of basic, almost Germanic. The King James translators had Peter say very simply, "Lord, it is good for us to be here," which is, I think, perfect. Yeah, that's the right one. And Harwood, poor Dr. Harwood, reaching high for propriety and perspicuity, has him say, "Oh, sir, what a delectable residence we might establish here." It's gone, hasn't it? It's gone. It's just gone. Now, the 19th century veered the other way. The King James Bible, for the Romantics, became such a kind of monument of old, authentic Englishness that even though the 19th century realized that the texts on which the King James Bible was based were not of the best, they were not the best manuscripts, the famous revised version that they made in the 1880s was nevertheless written in a kind of bogus Jacobeanism, as if you could only have the Bible speaking in Jacobean English. And so their very scholarly and exact revisions of the texts were cast in a language that was by then 280 years old. So, for example, using words like howbeit, peradventure, holden, aforetime, sudgeon, and behooved, none of which were in the King James Bible. You know, as if a kind of team of London solicitors had arrived for work in ruffs and doublets, you know. And the 20th century then veered the other way, both here and in England. Translations made in the 20th century were deliberately written in what one of the directors of the New English Bible called a timeless prose, in which he said hallowed associations were to be avoided, which is a curious thing to say about a Bible translation. And, quote, a sense of reality sought, as if the stories in the Bible were, you know, a description of ordinary life going on, which they clearly are not. So it is a strange thing, I think, that happened in the 20th century, that no century apart from the 16th produced more Bible translations than the 20th century. And almost without exception, they have a kind of banality about them, a precision, but a banality. And I was talking the other day about this to Richard Holloway, who is a Scottish theologian and Bishop of Edinburgh, ex-Bishop of Edinburgh, and asked him why it was that the 20th century had done this to the Bible. Why was it that these translations just embrace the ordinary so fervently? And he said it is simple enough that what they thought they wanted was logos, not mythos. Meaning, I think, that somehow the idea got around in the 20th century that what the Bible could give you was information, that it was actually almost like a manual, that it was simply a kind of the clearer and more basic and more obvious the translation was, the truer it would be. When, as Holloway said, and I agree with this, what really matters about sacred texts is mythos, which is the kind of surrounding haze of a sort of imaginative space, you could say, or the sense of mystery that is necessarily involved with the whole idea of a God being involved with a world. That is not an ordinary event or sequence of events. And if, as the 20th century wanted to do, you shear off the mythos, if you cut out what seems to be those imaginative excrescences and just concentrate somehow on a kind of solid core of information, the paradoxical effect is that you actually lose the essence. It's the excrescence which is the essence. I can see people shifting in their seat at that. But I will say one more thing, and then maybe we might have some questions. It's gone, I think. The moment clearly has gone in which something like the King James Bible could be made. And I think in some ways English, the language, maybe no longer has the faculty of religious language. It can't do it anymore. We don't know what it would be like. It clearly can't be an imitation of Jacobean English. That is a dead end of all dead ends. And it cannot be the kind of plain banality of 20th century translations. But what is it? Where on earth is it? I think it may not be there. It just may not exist. And all we have, in some ways, as a kind of echo from the past, is the beauty and mystery, and in many ways the obscurity and inaccuracy of the King James translation of the Bible, which I continue to think, even having spent, or perhaps particularly having spent 2 years in its company, is the greatest book in the language. Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
How's the Bible received? Was it instantly accepted?
No, very curiously, it was not. It was seen very much as a royal production, and the Geneva Bible continued to be enormously popular, much more popular than the King James Bible. James even had to try to suppress the Geneva Bible so that sales of the King James Bible would pick up. He failed, of course, because they went on being printed in the Netherlands and were imported by, among others, the King's own printer, Robert Barker, and continued to outstrip sales of the King James Bible right up until the Civil War. And the King James Bible only becomes the Bible of the English at the Restoration. And the reason for that is, I think, that it was a form of conservative reassurance. After the great rupture and destruction of the Civil War, this Bible did represent in some ways Old England, a continuity over the gap, and a sort of reassurance that everything had not been lost. The Pilgrim Fathers took the Geneva Bible with them. That was the Bible of Plymouth. Yes.
The American critic Harold Bloom has argued with some persuasiveness that Shakespeare and Cervantes, another contemporary of the period, were in some sense, that we can't examine in detail here, inventing the human being in the sense of complexity. You're probably familiar with this concept. It wouldn't seem that this is going on in the King James, that no character, probably not even God in the work, is emerging as a living thing. But the language with which you're presenting, I have not read your book, but which you're presenting your book to us tonight, suggests or hints to me that the text itself becomes a living thing. It's almost, maybe it's transcending its own Bible or its own source. If this is making any sense to you,
yes.
Could you comment on that?
Well, I think in some ways I did slightly talk about that in the relationship of the two. If you take Shakespeare, the Shakespearean impulse as one thing that is going on in Jacobean England, this bubbling vitality, and the controlling authoritarian thing, which is another kind of pole of Jacobean existence, that the Bible does have a kind of life between those poles. It's difficult to say. I mean, I think that any language is alive in some sense or another, isn't it? I don't think you can say that the language is the character of the Bible, if that's what you're suggesting.
No, but the text is taking on sort of a archetypal existence in our collective consciousness. It becomes the original Bible in the consciousness of Western, at least of Anglo-American civilization.
I'm sure that is undoubtedly true, but that too is a political fact. It isn't in the end a literary fact, that I don't think. That what happens is that, as I've just said, the Geneva Bible gets suppressed or is attempted to be suppressed. A war is fought over, essentially, these questions about, are you going to have a kind of relationship to God which is direct, demotic, democratic, liberal in some senses, or are you going to have a traditional, inherited, hierarchical structure? And England, in the end, plumps for that after the crisis of the Civil War. And the thing that embodies that conservative Anglican vision is the Bible. And I think you can see that as a political event. Yes, sir?
Did they translate the Old Testament from Greek or Hebrew?
Yes, there had been this long tradition of translation all through the 16th century, 8 major translations into English in the course of the 16th century. And you must imagine, I think, these translators with all these previous translations arrayed in front of them. But many of them were very good Greek and Hebrew scholars, and they certainly had Greek and Hebrew manuscripts. As I said, not of the best. And often they clearly didn't understand what they were translating. There are passages in the King James translation of Paul's epistles which are literal gobbledygook. They just did not get it. And I think the way to imagine it is it's this great joint enterprise, these large number of very gifted and deeply educated men applying all their energies to a text which they were deeply familiar with anyway. It's not as if they were coming new to some project. They were living in a Bible-drenched world. You had to go to church every Sunday or be fined in England. And hear a sermon on these texts and sing a long psalm every Sunday. So it's like they're addressing their own DNA. It is the stuff that their world is made of. Yes.
We're all, I think, familiar with the dreadfulness of governmental prose, usually. How do you explain the apparent miracle that this book has such high literary merit when there's a committee overseeing it?
That is the crux. That is the crux question. I don't know if you heard that governmental prose is usually catastrophic. How come this has literary qualities? What? Miles Smith has a lot to do with it. Lancelot Andrews has a lot to do with it. There were deeply talented people here. But I think there's something more than that, which is that distinction between governmental and non-governmental maybe is too modern a distinction. That somehow, Eliot wrote a famous essay in the 1920s about what he called the dissociation of sensibility, in which he said that early in the 17th century, every aspect of the mental, spiritual, intellectual and emotional, even political and social life of the English he's talking about, was somehow amalgamated into one organic whole. And that association of sensibility, for some reason, fell apart. You could call that falling apart the Enlightenment, if you like. That the kind of... and aspects of human life and mind became rational, governmental, emotional, spiritual, disintegrated. And I think that this moment, this first decade of the 17th century, is a moment of extraordinary integration. And you can see that these, some figure like Andrews, that he is everything. He's a fixer, a government minister, a church opportunist, corrupt, almost a torturer, certainly a state interrogator, a poet, a kind of theologian, a linguist, I mean, I know there are great men in Chicago, great men and women in Chicago, but you won't find a Lancelot Andrews here or anywhere in the world. That moment is over. I don't know if that's too mystical. One reviewer in England said I had a mystical approach to this, so perhaps I sign up to that. Yes, sir.
Did I hear you say it's a translation from the original text?
Translation. It is a translation.
From the original text?
Yes.
Where is the original text?
Well, the original text is a shorthand for the manuscripts in Hebrew and Greek which they had. There is, of course, no original text of the Gospels. They don't exist. And the manuscripts of the Hebrew scriptures are themselves very late. But there are Hebrew scriptures in Hebrew. And there are Greek texts of the New Testament. Does that make sense?
Translation from a translation.
Well, I don't know what arcane... What do you mean? You mean that God doesn't talk Greek?
It was written in Aramaic, supposedly.
No, the original of the New Testament was written in kind of Greek called koine, with some Aramaic elements in it. No? Well, we have to agree to disagree on that. Yes, sir.
When you're talking about style and content, and it seems like they're tied together because they're stylistically massaging the words to make them say what they want, but with all the revisions that we're lucky enough to have right now, they seem to have no quibble with the content, but only with the style. Is that a correct generalization? And
are you talking about modern translations?
Modern translations, and it seems that people say, well, we've got to make it more approachable. And I specifically wonder, the Y in the ye is a thorn in many cases. Why don't they could have made that a TH, and then people would have read thee, and they wouldn't say, oh, well, this is an old-fashioned thing. When did this conscious bit to keep the transposition of the TH, the thorn, as a Y rather than...
Yes, I mean, well, my take on this is that in fact the meaning that is in something like the King James Bible is in fact in its atmosphere. That is what you get from it. It is something about the beauty of holiness. And if that comes at the expense of having to read ye rather than thee, then that's fine by me. But I'm not, but I understand that can only be for me, and I can understand that if you are a modern church administrator or a missionary, and you want to get out to as many people as possible, then this archaic language may well be a stumbling block. I can understand that. I don't know what you can do about that, because I don't think there is a modern, accessible English which has that beauty. It doesn't exist. Is that an answer?
Yeah.
Of a kind.
Of a kind.
Of a kind, yeah.
But it just seems to me that the keeping the Y is a conscious archaism. And did anyone ever decide, hey, Frank, when we set it up, let's keep it as a Y rather than...
Yes. Well, I mean, one of the things that's interesting about the King James Bible is that a lot of it is consciously archaic. A lot of it is written in the language of the 1540s. Consciously, the language, I think you can develop something psychological about this, in the language of their father's generation, as if the holy has to be slightly removed, and you cannot have the holy written in the immediate language of newspapers now, or whatever. And in fact, you find that even in Jerome's great translation of the Greek and Hebrew text into Latin in the 4th century, the Vulgate, the great medieval Bible. Jerome wrote it in consciously archaic Latin. And this is, I think, a consistent pattern in religious literature, that somehow the old is holy. There is some binding there, and if you're trying to make it new, you lose something. Yes, ma'am.
Don't you think that one can read the Bible or different versions of the Bible for different purposes? Like read the King James Bible for the beauty and poetry and the mystery, and then read a more modern version simply to get the explanation of some phrases which don't quite make sense to us unless we have the explanation along with them.
I think that is perfectly fair, and I think and I will say that that's what I've done. That there are bits of the King James Bible I find a lot of Paul incredibly difficult to understand in the King James Bible, and it is very, very much easier to understand in modern translations. Yes, I would entirely agree with that. Yes.
To what extent does the King James Bible actually survive in terms of worship today? What's your impression about churches in England and America? Who uses the King James as compared to all the 20th century versions?
I don't know the answer to that. I think that on the whole, the King James Bible is used only by what are called very conservative churches, and that most churches are interested in the reach of modern clarified translations. And I met a woman the other day who said that she had translated, or was having part of the Bible translated into rap language, which was going to be sent out in what she called viral emails to people, mimicking the way of a virus. And so this rap gospel would be kind of infecting every computer. I don't really know whether people are using this Bible or not. I mean, it still sells, and I think that it is still the best-selling version of the Bible. But I think that too may be, just deep conservatism at work. I think I would only read the King James Bible for the pleasure of its words. That's what I would do, and I imagine that there are people who do that too. I don't know about churches. Yes, sir.
I apologize for the micro nature of this question, but many secondary sources that I'm aware of name someone named Nicholas Felton, who was Bishop of Ely, as among the translators of the Bible, and including the Dictionary of National Biography. And yet, your book and others I have seen, he has disappeared somehow. I just wondered if you could shed some light on that.
No, I can't. I have tried to get as many of this is an announcement which we're to ignore. Leah told me before. Okay, it is not. There is not a crisis happening. Okay, it's over. It's over now. It's not orange. I don't know about that. When was Nicholas Felton Bishop of Ely?
Right after Lancelot Andrewes.
Right.
They were friends and contemporaries.
Right. I am so sorry that I can shed no light on that at all. Yes.
Were these secretaries that you call them, did they take on the seriousness that they were dealing with God's inspired word? You mentioned some of them would pray for hours, or was it more just really, was it just a political document that they were doing for the king?
Well, it's difficult to interrogate people's hearts, even now, isn't it? And it's difficult to divine motivation at the distance of 400 years. But I think there's no doubting that everybody knew how important this was, and that nothing could be more important in Jacobean England than getting this right. And the sheer attention to detail. I go in the book into an extraordinary document which an American scholar found, which are some notes from the final revising committee, a kind of minuting their discussions. And the discussions are extremely careful, often quite angry, passionately argued. And and dancing around possibilities with a great sense of engagement and commitment. This is not done something that's done as a sort of casual career move. I mean, for many it was a really great career move, and all of the translators were promoted in some way or other up the church as a result. Jacobi in England believed in God, and how? It was.
I imagine the awe that they had working with the original text or
I think
translation.
there's more confidence in it than that. It's not a kind of fearful and a sort of tentative thing. This is the stuff of their world, and they are some of the most gifted manipulators of it, and they know it. Some of them are great kind of buccaneer figures who are taking swings through scholarship and politics and so on there's no sense of the tentative, because they're as qualified as anyone. And the thing about a secretary, whether a royal secretary or a divine secretary, is that they have no authority apart from their master. But as their master's secretary, they have all the authority in the world. And I think that these translators approach the task with just brimming with confidence and authority. Yes, ma'am.
I'm curious in a historical sense, in your putting together your story, did you have access to a lot of primary materials, letters, diaries, whatever, or had the story been told enough in the past that you could use that sort of thing? I'm fascinated from
the story has
aspect.
been often told, for sure, and it's been, especially in the 19th century, incredibly well trawled. And so all the documents that survive, I think, no, that's not quite true. Virtually all the documents have been printed in some form or other. There are some that survive only as manuscripts. There's a marvellous one in the Archbishop's Library in Lambeth, if you've been there, which is an early draft of some of the epistles written by one of the translators. There's a bishop's Bible in the Bodleian, which has clearly been annotated by a translator, and you can actually see him working through the text. Fascinating thing. And there are several letters between translators and so on like that. Most of the royal end of the sort of correspondence has disappeared because there was a great fire in Whitehall in 1619, and so there is very little manuscript stuff around. I mean, what survives are the writings of the translators, their other books and all of that. And a lot of my book is from that. It's really assembling everything outside so you can see the whole in the middle. Okay. Yes?
I will come to the earlier question of original New Testament. I mean, when was it put together? Who decided on the scripts? And basically, when was it put together, the original New Testament? And when was the first time it was translated into another language?
This is another question. This is another area. The area of kind of early New Testament studies is not something I'm at all expert in. But I know, for example, that I think in 1945 in Egypt, someone found a great jar filled with something like 40 or 50 manuscripts on papyrus, which were like other Gospels, the Gospel of St. Thomas, and I think there's some things by St. Peter, which simply don't appear in the New Testament. And it's perfectly clear that the New Testament is only a selection of the various texts which could have been included. Jesus was clearly only one figure, in fact, of a whole series of Jewish prophets at the time, many of whom were saying the same kind of thing. There were many other Gospels. And it is, in essence, I think, the short answer is, it's a Byzantine emperor, I think in about the 3rd century, who first gathers what's called the New Testament. And it then exists in Greek. And the first great translation is into Latin, I think, in about 350, something like that. It's not the right answer. You need to look further than that. Yeah. Yes, madam.
What is your definition of the Bible?
Sorry, can you say that again?
What is your definition of Bible?
Bible.
Bible.
Bible. My definition of Bible, I would say, is the traditional collection of books of Hebrew and Greek sculptures, which have formed the central book of the Christian tradition for the last 2,000 years. But there must be a subtext to that question.
I mean, I've learned so much just listening to you, and you have experience from different perspectives.
I realize, especially in America, I have a very, very different view of this to most Americans' view of the Bible. I think someone said to me in Washington the other day, you have such a secular view of this that you have found only the secular story. And I think in some ways that's true. Yes?
It's curious that you say the authors, though they tried to keep somewhat a simplified elegance to their translation, they still wound up injecting an archaic flavor to the actual words. And nowadays, if that happened to a current text, I would just assume that some marketing firm read an original draft and said, no, you've got to spiff it up a little bit. How do you suppose that happened back then?
Well, I think they wanted to do two things. They wanted to make a version of the Bible that was majestic and kingly, and in some ways that it was a marketing enterprise. You can see that. They wanted to project the idea that kings were godly and gods were kingly. And a grandeur of phrasing is to do with that. But they wanted it also to work. They wanted to get to the people. And so it had to have this clarified accessibility too. And I think that one of the miracles of it is that it is able to fuse these two very contradictory ideas. A simple grandeur is a strange idea, but it's what the King James Bible has. And it's what I think it's given to English. It made English speakers capable of speaking about and writing about very great things in very plain words. And it's something the French or the Germans have never had, for example. Is that an answer?
But do you think that, since there were a group of authors on this, do you think that they all just inevitably wound up injecting an archaic flair to it? Or did somehow it was there a direction?
There were no explicit instructions on style. The Archbishop didn't say, write it like this, and here's an example of how I want it to sound. But something of that double requirement that needed to do both People's Bible and King's Bible meant that it came out in that way, as a kind of emanation of the moment. It was the moment that made it, in a way. Any more? No. One more. Okay.
Is there any way of telling in the original translations how heavily they were edited by the time they got into the final version?
You can, as I said, there is this manuscript that survives of an early draft of the epistles, which is very like, but not entirely like, what is actually printed in the end. And so you can see a change there. There is the discussion in the notes taken in the final revising committee, and they are picking through things and throwing things out at will. I mean, without any hesitation. And there was one of them who wrote a letter complaining that Bancroft, the Archbishop, had fiddled with his perfect prose without telling him, as ever. It's the author-publisher relationship, isn't it? But I think that the whole process was endlessly sifting and weeding, and it was a continuous process all through. So it's not as if somehow the men of the church produced a version which the hierarchy then skewed in their direction. It was much more organically integrated than that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, actually I had a question and a comment. One, are any of your lectures on cassette tape? And two, the comment was, that recently I went to see a movie called The Gangs of New York, and some of you have seen it. There was a comment in the movie about, the guy had asked about the Bible or swearing on the Bible, and the person who he was speaking to said, "What do you mean, the one that was written by William Shakespeare?" So I just wanted to, did you have a comment on that?
What did he say about Shakespeare?
He referred to it as being written by William Shakespeare.
Oh, well.
When the guy questioned him about the authority of the Bible.
Right, okay.
That was his response.
Okay. Well, there's a very funny story by Rudyard Kipling, in which Shakespeare and Ben Jonson... Oh, sorry. Are you all right? Not a bit. Can I do anything? I'll stop yakking in a minute. This story called Proofs of Holy Writ by Kipling have Jonson and Shakespeare sitting in a pub together in London, getting drunk. And in through the door bursts a man of the church and says, "I've just come from Miles Smith and we're stuck. We don't know what to do. We don't, they've asked us to do this translation of the Bible, and we're just absolutely at a loss." And Shakespeare says, don't worry, I'll do it," and starts talking the Nunc Dimittis to this man who's just burst in the door. And it's people have that idea about this Bible, that somehow it needed great geniuses to do it. But the miracle of it is that it's a book of genius with no geniuses at its heart. And that's a mysterious and extraordinary thing. Oh, no, I don't. I'm sorry. No. But I'll come and talk to you again. Do I see these signs going on?
Mr. Nicolson will be signing books right in there by the podium, and books are for sale right outside the room. Thanks for coming.
Adam Nicolson is author of God's Secretaries, The Making of King James Bible. It's published by HarperCollins, on the web at harpercollins.com. Next week on History on Book TV, April Blood. Lauro Martinez explores the political feuds in Florence during the Italian Renaissance.